Early life and family, a noble beginning shadowed by struggle. Catherine Howard, the fifth wife of King Henry VIII, entered the world sometime between 1522 and 1525, born into one of England's most prominent yet financially troubled noble families. She was the daughter of Lord Edmund Howard and Lady Jocasta, Joyce, Culpeper. Despite her aristocratic bloodline, Catherine's early years were far from the luxury one might expect from someone of noble descent. Her father, Edmund, was the younger son of Thomas Howard, the second Duke of Norfolk, a powerful figure at court. But unlike his influential relatives, Edmund never found solid financial footing. Caught between the expectations of nobility and the harsh reality of limited means, he struggled to maintain the lavish lifestyle typically associated with his rank. His economic difficulties weren't just inconvenient, they had lasting consequences for his children, especially Catherine. Tragedy struck early in Catherine's life with the death of her mother, Jocasta. Following this loss, and with her father unable to provide stable care, Catherine was sent to live with relatives, most notably, her step-grandmother Agnes Tilney, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. The Duchess oversaw a large household that doubled as an informal finishing school for young noblewomen. It was in this bustling environment at Chesworth House in Sussex and later at Lambeth Palace in London, that Catherine spent her formative years. But life under the Dowager Duchess was far from disciplined. The household was large and somewhat loosely supervised, giving Catherine and the other young ladies a surprising amount of freedom for the time. Without strict guidance or structure, she was left to navigate the complexities of adolescence and courtly expectations largely on her own. Despite these challenges, Catherine's noble heritage offered her connections that would eventually place her in the orbit of the Tudor court. As a Howard, she was part of one of the most influential families in England, and her powerful uncle, Thomas Howard, the third Duke of Norfolk, played a critical role in advancing her status. Though her early life was shaped by financial instability and personal loss, Catherine's beauty, charm, and noble lineage would open doors, first into the court as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Anne of Cleves, and eventually into the heart and throne of King Henry VIII. Yet, the freedom and lack of oversight she experienced as a teenager would cast long shadows over her future, as the relationships she formed in her youth would come back to haunt her in the most tragic of ways. In many ways, Catherine Howard's story begins not in a palace, but in the quiet chaos of a noble household struggling to maintain appearances. Her upbringing was a delicate balance of privilege and neglect, which would shape the young woman who would briefly become queen, and ultimately, a tragic figure in one of history's most dramatic royal sagas. A carefree court in miniature, Catherine Howard's life under the Dowager Duchess. After the early death of her mother and her father's ongoing financial hardship, young Catherine Howard was placed in the care of her step-grandmother, Agnes Howard, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. Though this move was intended to provide stability and refinement, what Catherine found in the Duchess's grand household was something quite different, an upbringing marked more by freedom than formality, and a world where appearances often masked a lack of structure. The Dowager Duchess presided over a large and prestigious estate that functioned almost like a training ground for noble girls. Here, daughters of the aristocracy and well-born families were sent to be finished, taught the etiquette, accomplishments, and comportment expected of women destined for influential marriages or court appointments. Catherine, a Howard by birth, was among the most distinguished of the girls in residence, yet the environment was far less disciplined than its reputation suggested. Catherine shared sleeping quarters with several other young women, living in a dormitory-style arrangement that fostered a sense of camaraderie, but also allowed for mischief to flourish. The household lacked close supervision, particularly during the evenings, giving the girls an unusual amount of privacy for the time. This leniency would later have profound consequences, but at the time, it created an atmosphere that was more playful and social than educational. Despite the somewhat chaotic environment, Catherine's noble lineage gave her an edge over her peers. As a member of the powerful Howard family, she enjoyed a certain level of deference and status, even among the other aristocratic girls. Her name carried weight, and her connections, particularly to her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, ensured that she would be noticed, both within and beyond the Duchess's walls. However, while Catherine may have carried herself with the poise expected of a Howard, her education was far from comprehensive. She likely received instruction in music, dance, and perhaps basic literacy, but much of her learning came through observation and imitation, rather than formal teaching. Emotional maturity, restraint, and awareness of court politics were left to chance. The relaxed atmosphere of the Dowager Duchess's household also allowed Catherine to form private relationships with men, relationships that, though common in such loosely managed households, would later be used against her with devastating consequences. At the time, these interactions may have seemed harmless or even romantic, but they stood in sharp contrast to the strict moral expectations placed on women at court, especially those in the Queen's circle. Looking back, Catherine's time in the Dowager Duchess's care was a pivotal period that set the stage for both her rise and fall. In a world where family name could open palace doors, her Howard heritage propelled her forward, but the freedom and lack of guidance during these early years left her dangerously unprepared for the cutthroat world of Tudor politics and courtly intrigue. Lessons in Grace and Secrets: Catherine Howard's early education and romantic entanglements. Catherine Howard's early years were shaped not just by her noble birth and loose supervision but also by a particular kind of education, one designed to mold her into a charming, graceful presence rather than an intellectually equipped woman. Like many young noblewomen of her time, her instruction focused more on appearance and social polish than on academic depth. In the grand household of the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, Catherine was taught the skills necessary to thrive in courtly life. She likely received training in the art of etiquette, how to speak, move, and carry herself in a way that reflected both grace and obedience. Music and dance were also central to her education, crucial talents for a woman expected to entertain, charm, and fit seamlessly into the glittering but demanding world of the Tudor court. However, reading, writing, and scholarly pursuits were not emphasized. Catherine's intellectual education was minimal at best. She may have learned to read well enough to get by, but there's little evidence to suggest she was offered the kind of rigorous academic training that more privileged girls, like her cousin Anne Boleyn, might have received at European courts. Instead, Catherine was shaped more by her environment than by any formal curriculum. Within this lax and lively setting, Catherine's earliest romantic experiences began to unfold. One of the first to take an interest in her was Henry Manox, her music tutor. What began as flirtation eventually evolved into a more intimate relationship. Manox, older and in a position of authority, pursued Catherine with boldness, and their interactions crossed boundaries that, while overlooked at the time, would become damning in hindsight. Shortly after her involvement with Manox cooled, Catherine became romantically attached to Francis Dereham, a gentleman with ties to the Howard family. Their relationship was far more serious, and they behaved as though they were engaged, if not secretly married. Catherine referred to Dereham as her husband, and he to her as his wife, terms that, in Tudor society, could carry significant weight. They exchanged promises, shared affection, and, by many accounts, lived as if they were bound to one another. These early entanglements, conducted in the shadows of a household lacking in discipline, would not remain secret forever. Though at the time they may have seemed little more than youthful missteps or expressions of affection, they would later be resurrected as key pieces of evidence against her. In the rigid moral landscape of Henry VIII's court, past behavior, especially that of a queen, was subject to brutal scrutiny. For Catherine, these relationships weren't just fleeting romances, they were defining moments in a life teetering between the freedom of youth and the harsh expectations of royal duty. Her charm, beauty, and lively spirit would carry her far, but the ghosts of her past, born during these early, unsupervised years, would eventually follow her all the way to the throne, and beyond. From lady-in-waiting to queen, Catherine Howard's swift ascent. Catherine Howard's journey to the throne was as rapid as it was unexpected. In a court fueled by ambition, beauty, and political maneuvering, her rise from a relatively unknown noblewoman to Queen of England unfolded with astonishing speed, propelled by powerful family connections and the wandering eye of an aging king. In the late 1530s, Catherine was sent to the royal court by her influential uncle, Thomas Howard, the 3rd Duke of Norfolk. The Howards were one of the most prominent families in England, and her uncle saw in Catherine an opportunity to increase the family's influence at the heart of Tudor power. She joined the household of Queen Anne of Cleves, Henry VIII's fourth wife, as a lady-in-waiting, a coveted position that placed her directly within the king's orbit. At the time, Anne of Cleves' marriage to Henry was faltering. The union had been arranged for political reasons, but Henry was immediately disappointed by Anne, claiming she lacked beauty and charm. Their marriage was never consummated, and the king soon began to look elsewhere for companionship. That's when his gaze fell upon the young, vibrant Catherine. Catherine stood in stark contrast to Anne. She was youthful, flirtatious, and possessed the lively spirit Henry craved. Though barely in her late teens and decades younger than the king, Catherine exuded an effortless allure. She captivated him quickly, and before long, whispers of their growing affection spread through court. What may have started as courtly flirtation evolved rapidly into something much more serious. As Henry pushed forward with the annulment of his marriage to Anne of Cleves, his attentions turned fully toward Catherine. Her family, especially the Duke of Norfolk, encouraged the match. For the Howards, having another relative on the throne, after Anne Boleyn's doomed queenship, was a chance at redemption and renewed influence. Just weeks after Henry's divorce from Anne was finalized, Catherine and the king were married in a quiet ceremony on July 28, 1540. That same day, Thomas Cromwell, one of the architects of Anne's marriage and a longtime royal advisor, was executed, clearing the way for a new political chapter. Catherine, now Queen of England, was suddenly thrust into the spotlight. Her elevation was dramatic, even by Tudor standards. In a matter of months, she had gone from an overlooked lady-in-waiting to one of the most powerful women in the realm. At court, she was celebrated as the Rose without a thorn, a nickname reflecting her youth and apparent innocence. Henry, enchanted by his new bride, showered her with gifts, jewels, and titles for her relatives. But beneath the surface of royal splendor, Catherine's past and present were on a collision course. The very qualities that drew the king to her, her charm, her beauty, her youthful spark, also made her vulnerable in a court teeming with secrets, jealousy, and danger. Her story as queen had only just begun, but the path ahead would prove far more perilous than the one that led her to the throne. The brief reign and tragic fall of Catherine Howard. Catherine Howard's time as queen began like a fairy tale, adored by her king, admired at court, and surrounded by opulence. King Henry VIII, nearly 3 decades her senior, was utterly smitten. He lavished her with jewels, gowns, and praise, declaring her his rose without a thorn. For a brief moment, Catherine seemed to bring new life to the aging monarch, offering him the youth and affection he craved. But behind the gilded facade, shadows from Catherine's past were gathering. Though her reign appeared idyllic on the surface, whispers about her earlier life began to circulate. Members of the court, driven by envy, ambition, or duty, quietly brought troubling details to light, specifically, rumors of intimate relationships she had before her marriage to the king. The most damaging were her former entanglements with Henry Maddox and Francis Dereham, men she had known during her teenage years in the Dowager Duchess's household. When these revelations reached Henry, he was shaken, but the worst was yet to come. During the investigation into her past, it was uncovered that Catherine had allegedly grown close to Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the king's privy chamber, even after becoming queen. Secret meetings, love letters, and testimony from household staff painted a picture that suggested more than innocent conversation. Whether the relationship was consummated remains debated, but the implications were enough to spark a full-scale scandal. Catherine was arrested and held in confinement at Hampton Court Palace. Eventually, she was moved to the Tower of London, where her fate was sealed. On February 13, 1542, just over a year and a half after becoming queen, Catherine Howard was executed for treason. She was barely 20 years old. Catherine's fall from grace was swift and brutal, a stark reminder of how quickly fortunes could turn in the Tudor court. Once a cherished bride and queen, she died condemned and disgraced, caught in the deadly crosshairs of royal power, youthful mistakes, and a court that thrived on secrets. Rewriting the legacy, a new look at Catherine Howard. For centuries, Catherine Howard was cast in a narrow and unforgiving light, dismissed as frivolous, foolish, and dangerously flirtatious. She was often painted as a young woman who recklessly betrayed her royal husband and paid the ultimate price for her indiscretions. But in recent years, historians have begun to challenge this one-dimensional portrait, offering a far more nuanced, and deeply human, interpretation of her life and death. At the heart of this reassessment is a recognition of Catherine's age and vulnerability. When she became queen, Catherine was likely only 17 or 18 years old, hardly an adult by modern standards. Far from being the seductress of popular legend, many scholars now view her as a teenager caught in a dangerous web of political ambition, courtly manipulation, and male dominance. In the household of the Dowager Duchess, where Catherine spent her formative years, boundaries were poorly maintained and adult men had easy access to young girls. Her earliest romantic encounters, long held up as evidence of her moral failings, are now re-examined as situations in which power and consent were deeply unbalanced. Henry Mannix, her music teacher, and Francis Dereham, a man in her household, were both significantly older and in positions of authority. What was once labeled promiscuity is increasingly recognized as grooming and exploitation. Even her later connection to Thomas Culpeper, the courtier with whom she was accused of committing adultery, is now interpreted through a different lens. Some historians suggest the relationship may not have been entirely consensual or at the very least, complicated by pressure and fear. In a court where women had little autonomy and reputations could be destroyed by rumor alone, Catherine's choices were likely shaped by far more than simple desire. Her execution, rather than being the justified punishment of a deceitful queen, is now widely seen as a tragic result of the brutal power dynamics of Tudor England. Caught between a much older, jealous king and a court eager to control or destroy her, Catherine had few allies and even fewer options. Her downfall was not simply the result of scandal, but of a system that allowed young women to be used as political pawns and then discarded when no longer convenient. Modern historians have begun to frame Catherine Howard not as a villain, but as a victim, a girl raised without proper guidance, manipulated by those around her, and ultimately destroyed by the very forces that elevated her. Today, her story resonates with new meaning. It serves as a cautionary tale about power, gender, and the dangers of silencing young voices. In reassessing Catherine's life, we not only reclaim her humanity, but also shed light on the darker truths of one of history's most infamous courts. Two Catherines, two fates, legacy, survival, and the last queen of Henry VIII. In the shadow of Catherine Howard's tragic downfall rose another queen, one with a very different story, and an even more distinct legacy. Catherine Parr, the sixth and final wife of Henry VIII, stands in striking contrast to her ill-fated predecessor. Where Catherine Howard was young, inexperienced, and caught in the ruthless games of courtly survival, Catherine Parr was mature, educated, and politically astute. Their lives reflect the shifting tides of Tudor England and the varying roles women could play at the heart of royal power. By the time she married Henry in 1543, Catherine Parr had already been widowed twice and had navigated the complexities of noble life with intelligence and grace. She was in her 30s, older than Henry's previous queens at the time of marriage, and brought a calm wisdom to the court that had long been absent. Unlike Catherine Howard, whose brief queenship was defined by romance and scandal, Catherine Parr's time as queen was shaped by diplomacy, education, and religious influence. A passionate supporter of learning, Catherine championed education not just for men but for women as well, an idea that was still radical in the 16th century. She wrote several books, including prayers or meditations, becoming the first English queen to publish under her own name. She also took a strong interest in the education of Henry's children, especially Elizabeth and Edward, helping shape their intellectual and religious foundations. Her advocacy for learning and literacy would leave a lasting imprint, particularly in Elizabeth I, whose reign would be known for its cultural and literary flourishing. Religiously, Catherine Parr leaned toward Protestant reform at a time when the English Reformation was still taking shape. She surrounded herself with reformist thinkers and used her influence to protect and promote Protestant ideas. Though she had to tread carefully, Henry remained unpredictable and occasionally hostile toward reform. She managed to walk the tightrope of religious politics with skill. At one point, she narrowly avoided arrest for her reformist beliefs, demonstrating not only her conviction but also her sharp political instincts. Catherine Parr outlived Henry VIII, becoming the first of his wives to do so. However, her story didn't end with the king's death. She soon married Thomas Seymour, a longtime suitor, and seemed poised for a more personal chapter in her life. But happiness was fleeting. In 1548, Catherine gave birth to her only child, a daughter named Mary. Tragically, just days later, she died from postnatal complications. Though her life ended in sorrow, Catherine Parr's legacy endures through her contributions to education and religious reform. She helped redefine what it meant to be queen, not merely a consort or decoration, but an intellectual and moral force in the kingdom. When compared to Catherine Howard, Catherine Parr's path highlights the stark differences in how Tudor queens could rise, reign, and fall, or survive. One was a teenager caught in a world she couldn't control, the other, a scholar and reformer who shaped history with a pen rather than a crown.